Good evening and thank you. If you give me just a second, I'm going to share. So rather than use slides, what I chose to do for this evening is use for my visuals the continuity of learning plan that was uploaded, which is the PDF document. And so I'll work through that, but that way also I'll try to keep announcing the pages I'm on, so people who are only able to listen in on the meeting, you have access to that PDF and you can follow it. I, of course, am, very aware of all of the comments. I mean, those we've received tonight, the frustration that's present in the county, but I think some of our board members did a really nice job sort of capturing the big picture of this, that we know this is, in many ways, this topic is among the most talked about in the country right now. And our plan is not perfect. We still have many questions to answer, and I do apologize that there aren't more concrete answers in some of the places, but I do feel we're in a place to be able to do that for everybody in short order. Hopefully we'll address some of those questions tonight, and people can hear some of those. I'm going to walk through some of the details that are new since this came out. I want to step back for just a second to talk about just over here. I want to step back for just a second to talk about where we were. So on July 13th, we proposed the model, which we heard referenced this evening, with three different stages. Stage 1, fully virtual; Stage 2, which was the hybrid model; and Stage 3, which should we be able to move to the governor's Stage 3. It was more in-person instruction, albeit probably with some restrictions, but right now we have very little detail around that. But we answered this before in the town hall, but I believe, I think it bears repeating here. People ask what changed. Was it? I think we've heard the suggestions that this was the union, and I also heard a couple of board members this evening say, it certainly was not political pressure from the union, and I will endorse that fully. This was not about politics. This has not been a political decision, but it was about looking at a hybrid plan at a time when we were beginning to see numbers start to spike a little bit. We saw things beginning to go up. We went through June with a great deal of optimism that the numbers were going sort of uninterrupted in a downward trajectory. And but what that left us with a hybrid plan that, while we were able to address a lot of the safety guidance that we had at the time, it still had many holes, and it had many logistical issues that we could not deliver on with the number of people we had. And the other major condition that you saw changing, and this is less bearing on our decision, but I think sort of represents the fact that at this point, so far as I'm aware, every other district in this state also began moving to a fully virtual, because I think the conclusion they were coming to quite independently was that the hybrid model, as we mapped it out with the number of students we have and the number of students we would need to split up and all of the moving parts, we were not going to be able to deliver either logistically to provide a good instructional program, or to deliver on the safety expectations that we thought were so important. Our role is multifaceted. Obviously, we have to deliver an instructional program, and that is very important. We've talked about that, and we'll go into much more about that tonight. As an organization, we do have to be thoughtful about what we are doing and whether we may or may not be contributing to the community spread of this transmission. So it's not just about the individuals, and who's more at risk and who's less at risk. But the actions we're taking and the plans we're putting in place, if what we're doing creates an uptick in community spread, that's an impact on the entire community. We've been fortunate in Harford County that the community transmission remains fairly low, and I think also fortunate that what we saw as a possible uptick that was beginning just a couple of weeks ago, we've seen now slide for 8 straight days in an appropriate direction, where our positivity rates in this county have gone down for 8 straight days, and that's very encouraging. People ask about the metrics we're looking at. There is no single metric, but I do rely on guidance, most notably from our health department here in Harford County. Information gleaned not only in individual conversations, but also in listening to the reports, the biweekly pandemic calls that the county hosts that have been tremendously informative. So the 4 major metrics that we're always measuring: the positivity rate, new infections, hospitalization, and death rates. But it seems the positivity rate sort of gets the highest billing in that, and so that's something we're constantly looking at. As of now, we remain as a state in stage 2. None of the governor's press conferences have yet indicated that we were moving to stage 3. I think there still remains some ambiguity as to what flexibility school systems have with regard to reopening, but any interpretation of the current executive orders would suggest that the option of going to fully in-person instruction is not an option in the state right now. But that is something we will be watching for. We had announced the intention to stay on track with the virtual and the learning centers through the remainder of this semester. But that being said, as we, I think Dr. Phillips spoke to this a little bit in his comments, as we, see the changes, if we're able to sustain particularly low numbers in the county for a significant period of time, we can consider adjusting our plans, but please know that moving from stage to stage is not a simple process, and it will take time. So, once we've had some time to assess where we are. So I don't know, Dr. Phillips, if we can deliver on your hope of, being more in person by the end of 2020, but we certainly are willing to, continue watching the data, because we absolutely understand the impact that not being in person has on our students. We're well aware of the research and those circumstances. We're well aware of people's interest to be in person. So let me move on to some of the specifics you'll see in the plan. We have a couple things, and circumstances continue to change. And one of the reasons it's been harder to give some of the really finite answers to some of the questions that people have been asking is it seems our circumstances are changing every day. One of the things, probably 2 things logistically that are significantly challenging to us and to some degree outside our control. One is our ability to access and have a confident pipeline of personal protective equipment. In speaking with local medical authorities, that has been a significant challenge throughout. And right now, understandably, our health department is getting shipments of those, but because our medical providers and our retirement facilities are operating now and have the greatest priority, that they're getting the majority of what's coming through. But we need to ensure that we can deliver this plan we have as safely as possible. So one of the things that will be a variable in our ability to go more in person is as a predictable source of PPE for those, particularly those adults who will be delivering some sorts of services. In addition to that, we learned today, and this is one of the effects of maybe some of our global pipeline challenges, but we learned today that about nearly 15,000 of the 27,000 Chromebooks we ordered are going to be delayed beyond the opening day of school. We are anticipating a little more than 13,000 to be delivered, and so we do have contingency plans that we can begin working on. We gathered a great deal of data from people in the spring about who needs computers most and who was not able to access online learning in the spring, and so we know where to prioritize those that we do have to distribute. But like so many things that have occurred through this pandemic, one challenge after another keeps confronting itself and requiring us to sort of switch and build a new plan. And so that's something, we have brand new data related, we have brand new information on that, we should be learning more, but that will cause us to, again, revisit how we are able to distribute materials to students, because we had begun, I think, pretty comprehensive plans to distribute materials, all sorts of materials of instruction to students at the beginning of school, and so that's something we're going to once again need to revisit. So let's go through the plan a little bit. So this first part, the key foundations: equity, special student populations, technology curriculum, professional learning, and then stakeholder input. I think we've heard a lot about each of these. This particular part has not changed. I know we had many questions about how stakeholder input is being used this evening, but we still have gone through the process with lots of conversations asking about how best to design this plan, and I know much frustration. That being said, we continue receiving, updating. We have conversations, we have additional focus groups planned to talk to people, and that's always informing our plans. We will mine the messages we received this evening to pull the questions from there. I mean, I know in many cases there was a lot of advocacy tonight, but there are also some very legitimate, viable, reasonable questions that emerged, and we will do our best to get all of those and respond to them one at a time. If you go to page 3, where we talk about curriculum and instruction, one of the things I think that's creating a lot of anxiety, perhaps worry, is the fact that we recognize that the instructional program and our ability to deliver that, particularly without greater virtual learning options and without a high level of connectivity for students, and many students without devices in the spring, that the program we were able to deliver in the spring was not adequate. That being said, a tremendous amount of work has gone into redesigning the curriculum so that both the sequence of the instruction, the sort of scope and size of the weekly work is better matched to virtual learning. The pacing is a little more precise so that we can keep people in line, because as we know, we've had many changes to do. But then also the instructional delivery model, that's the sort of the biggest part. We had a great deal of feedback that we needed much more synchronous learning, much more sort of face-to-face conversations between students and teachers, and that is a significant element of what we have in this plan, that there will be much more of that. And there's also been a tremendous amount of training to support teachers to do that. There's one part here, it's sort of the larger paragraph in the middle of page 3, and I'll actually zoom in on it. I know you've all had a chance to review this, but we still have more. The synchronous learning option was something that came as feedback when we released the last plan, that we had questions from many families that were not able to sit with their children during the day and make sure they stayed guided, and they wanted to be able to access the work in an asynchronous manner and work directly with their children. And so this is something that we are working on. We still have details to figure out in terms of who will be providing feedback for that and checking in with the families as they're doing this and providing the guidance around that, because the majority of our regular classroom teachers will be teaching their individual classes, albeit remotely, but they will be doing that work. And so we're trying to figure out who the best people will be to deliver the asynchronous instruction. But we've done a lot of work to make sure that we have that to offer families who don't believe that their children will be able to work as well in the synchronous model. So more to follow on that. And then there were also a lot of comments prior to the last meeting and from our digital learning survey about our learning management system. Again, a great deal of training, many changes to how that looks and how it works for folks. And so Yes Learning will be the primary platform, but we've also given some guidance. I have a document that I sent to board members last week, just as a copy so you could see it. It was the document sent to instructional staff that described some of the changes to the instructional program, but also the expectations for their training and many of their expectations for how they will operate in a synchronous environment. I shared that with you so you could see greater detail. That's really designed for staff, but it does provide, I think, much more information about how we will be delivering the instructional program. If you go to the next page, where am I? We talk about social and emotional wellness. As we've said, we've had groups working on ensuring we're able to deliver support in many different ways with many different types of outreach. So some of that is individuals reaching out, but it's also building lessons and elements we can use within the instruction to support students. And then, of course, employee well-being is also part of this. So we've had training around that. And again, other strategies we're focused on to improve that. I think our next one is accountability. This is another area where there was a lot of feedback, and I don't think we had as many of the details in here when we presented this back in July. So everything remains aligned to the Maryland standards, and that hasn't changed, but I think we've tightened that up quite a bit to make it sort of clearer and more concrete, and also, as we said, so the pacing is more manageable. Attendance was an area that's been a big question. The expectation now is that we will gather our attendance through when the students are logging in to the learning platform. So they do need to access, and teachers will take attendance in the Teacher Access Center once students have logged in and are able to see them. So it will still be virtual attendance, but we have to record that, and that's an expectation for all students, and it will be recorded as absent or present if they're logging in or not. Assessing learning gaps is one of the key elements from the Maryland expectations, but the idea is, that we will need to determine where students stand. We have as we've indicated here, systemic reading and mathematic assessments will be administered to students in order to provide information to teachers in regard to student strengths and areas for growth. Needing to assess those gaps that may have emerged through the spring. I know we were able to deliver a lot of instruction to students over the summer. We had many students participate in the summer learning camps, and as well as the one-to-one tutoring. We had many students signed up in benefiting from that also. So hopefully we were able to get to some of our students who needed the most there. Grading and reporting was another question. So the expectation is we will be returning to more traditional grading. So our letter grades will be in place. One change from our normal grading practice is normally in our elementary schools, the first quarter is not a letter grade, but it is actually, that's where we use the conference. And in fact, that's where the model that we used in the spring to do conferences with elementary students was borrowed from our normal grading process. But I think we felt that this year, we've had the conferences in the spring, that this year we're actually going to adjust the grading practice we do so that everyone will receive first quarter grades. We think it's so important that people see a sort of a more clear picture of their individual students' progress. So our grading will, again, resemble a more traditional grading process that we use with our letter grades, and our elementary families who might be used to having that conference in the first quarter will actually be doing report cards for them as well during that time. And then students who need further instructional supports may participate in other approved intervention programs. Again, we have those lined out in our structural program. So let me turn quickly to special needs, but I'm going to give Mike Thatcher just a second. I'm going to give a heads up. I'm going to talk for another minute, but I'm going to turn it over to him because we had a couple questions specifically from board members. And I'd like to give Mr. Thatcher a chance to sort of explain some of this in greater detail. As we've indicated here in other parts of the plan, that it is our intention to work directly with families, particularly with students who have special needs, to engage them in their IEPs and make sure that we're modifying what we need to do to deliver the best possible program for those students. Ongoing monitoring of student progress. in my conversations with Mr. Thatcher about the work that's been done so far. There's been a tremendous amount of training to prepare to meet the needs of our students, and I'll let him talk a little bit about that. Very briefly, I just want to mention the face-to-face testing is something that's listed here. So to clarify, obviously, that's the testing that occurs for special education students to assess their progress or their need for different services with regard to special education. And that's something that actually is one of the first sort of large-scale face-to-face activities we're engaging in, and it's been quite a lot to sort of make sure we have, again, the PPE in place to allow for that type of testing in the spring, not just in HCPS, but in probably every other district in the country. It became difficult for schools and school systems to meet their testing calendars, their testing deadlines. And so now being able to create an environment to go back and ensure we can do those tests in person has been one of the major priorities going through this summer. So we have that in place. But with that said, Mr. Thatcher, if you wouldn't mind commenting just briefly, because I know Ms. Rush referenced the question and others followed her behind that. But I think that you can speak a little more specifically about what families can expect with regard to the IEP, and then what we might transition beyond that. And I'll jump back in after you've had a chance.
Thank you, Dr. Bulson. Again, this is Mike Thatcher. I'm the Director of Special Education. In the spring, when our instruction was interrupted due to COVID, we had to react rather quickly to be able to deliver instruction to our students at home, many of whom did not have devices. And we worked with our special education staff to develop what was called an individual distance learning plan that required all of our case managers to get in touch with all 5,143 families to discuss, especially because we did not know how long this would last, a distance learning plan that was agreed upon based on the circumstances of the family, where their child's needs were, and to be able to deliver those services in a distance learning environment where we were. After taking a look at the decision of the superintendent to go back virtually, and that is the decision for the fall, 100% virtual for the first semester, and the ability to also offer learning support centers for those students to be able to access supervision and Wi-Fi in a safe environment based on family need. We determined that it is important, because of our work with curriculum, to be able to go back to the IEP. And that is going to take another contact with families, which is why we were very comfortable to state that we are going to get back in touch with families to figure out the learning needs during the transition to the 2021 school year. I think expectations for service delivery this fall will be significantly different than in the spring. I think that parents will see an increase in opportunities for synchronous learning. I think that special education teachers are going to make necessary amendments to the IEP with parental input, not necessarily based on a reduction in service hours, but perhaps a modification so that those services can best be delivered in frequency and in duration to fit the virtual model. And again, those will be decisions that are made with the parents, with the case managers, the folks who know the students the best together. And I think that that's a smart partnership moving forward. I think that what we found in the spring, and I can be honest and say it certainly was not a perfect plan, but we did our best in light of the circumstances. I think that what we noticed is when our consultation with our parents and that partnership was present, that was where I think we were able to maximize all the instructional benefit for the students, because the parents knew the students the best. They knew the specific home situation with some of the things that were up in the air. So I know that there are other particular questions, but I wanted to give you an overview of the biggest change that parents would see in the increased opportunities for synchronous learning. And I certainly can talk more in depth about that with particular questions, but I wanted parents to know that the distance learning plans are going to be put to bed, and we are going to go back to the IEP and help the students progress this fall with our virtual model. I'll be glad to take any follow-up questions the board members may
Actually,
have.
Mr. Thatcher, I'm gonna just stay tuned because I know there will be questions. I'll finish my presentation. So thank you for that. And I think there probably will be some more questions, but I'm gonna sort of push through for a couple more minutes on the plan, and then we'll get back to that in just a second. So thank you. One thing I would like to discuss briefly is, I particularly wanted to have you hear a little bit from Mr. Thatcher, because we know that going into the certain circumstance where we have the learning centers, the learning centers are both new for us and currently unprecedented in Maryland. What they allow us to do is maintain small group size, maintain groups in cohorts that won't be mixing with other groups, maintain the adults in there, but we still have a lot to work out. I know they seem fairly straightforward to some folks, but we have many, many details to still get the planning right for all of those to make sure we can deliver that safely. But I genuinely believe that when we get to the end of this work, we will be able to deliver a safe environment for everyone involved. And that means both our staff and our students. And so, but to do that, we need adequate people in place. We need the PPE in place. But the reason I say that at this point is once we've had a chance to get those open and operating, and I believe once we consider hammer out the, any details or surprises that emerge in the first week, as we make sure that those can operate as smoothly as possible and safely as possible, and have absolute confidence that we can create these in-person experiences. Well, it's not the instruction people are hoping for at this point, where we can create these in-person experiences in our schools, and we can do that safely. We can establish that having students there. Once we can get that settled and working, that's when we start looking at how we bring in our students who are even more impacted. We start in a very deliberate manner. The next step, and Mr. Thatcher and I spoke briefly about this, I think we're in agreement that the next step, once we have the work in place for the learning centers and we have those operating, then we want to start looking at how to provide in-person services for the students who need it the absolute most. We have them, and we can rank that different ways, but we know, particularly with our special ed population, we have students who absolutely benefit much more from the in-person instruction, and that is a key element. And so we want to get as quickly into doing something in person. We wanted to get as quickly into doing something in person for those students. And again, that relies on us having the right staff in place, having the right PPE in place, and making sure we can follow those protocols. So please know there is a commitment that starting with the learning centers is our first foray into in-person activity with the schools. And I would note that I am not aware yet of another district in Maryland that is planning for any in-person work on day one. Now some are still yet to release more formal plans. But even the learning centers, in terms of in-person work right now for the opening of school in Maryland, at least in our public schools, that is unprecedented. But I do believe having those in place allows us to work through the processes of delivering the physical distancing we need to do, of having our protocols for the safety in place, but also seeing what impact that has. I think, we've heard a lot about the science and infection, and I'm very hopeful that we don't see upticks in infection. I mean, we've seen other school districts in this country that have tried to go back in the last few weeks that have had very negative experiences. One school didn't make it a day. Again, there's evidence on both sides. You know, we can cherry pick that because I've also seen the evidence of the places where it's working well. This is our way of testing those processes for us, and we will continue to reevaluate. And if we can deliver success in this model, that I do believe we have a very reasonable opening then to start looking at how we can do more in-person work. So moving on, I'm only on page 7. Addressing technology needs, I know we've talked about that. There's much more to go there, but I don't think this is particularly new in the plan. It is our intent to deliver a device to every single student in this district. It will be important, not just for the distance learning part, but for our students to have all those devices when they're coming in person. I think, you know, the idea of having a device that we're able to install our security, that can access our networks in a much more reasonable fashion, because it does concern us the risk that might come with any sort of BYOT. But as I indicated at the beginning of this presentation, one of the curveballs we got today is we want to have all those devices to deploy before the school year starts, so we know we have to prioritize those students who we know had more trouble accessing the online instruction, because I feel like we can still deliver on all the synchronous pieces, and that will get better as we're able to put out even more devices. We've also indicated here that we're still in discussion. We're still working on how to upgrade our supports for our pre-K students. We know that devices aren't the best answer, because for those students, we are also working on creating packets of learning, not just paper, but actual materials of instruction to deliver to students, to have more manipulatives and those sorts of things to work. So we're looking at other ways to support our students with resources that will help them. Device distribution, again, this plan as of today will need to all be adjusted, but we will. But again, I guess when we've seen what's happened with technology and knowing the overwhelming demand, we can't say this is a 100% surprise. So, you know, this is something we were thinking about, but really hoping to avoid having to have a more targeted delivery. We're hoping at least this one part would go a little more smoothly, but again, we will get through that. Support for use of devices, a number of pieces here. Again, easier to provide support when you're talking about all one device. It's a little harder when you're doing something with bring your own, but we will be having a help desk with folks there to answer questions specific to individuals. Now, we think a lot of the questions can get sorted out at the school level, but we're working to make sure that we also have some central supports to strengthen our ability just to give basic logging on and simple technology support to students. Okay, I'm going to keep moving through that. Okay, this is where we describe a little bit of the virtual classroom learning. Again, you've been able to look at this. I touched on the special ed part. We do have the devices for the teachers have come in. So we know we have that part for our teachers, and also our teachers will be able to work from school if they need to be in a school with a more secure internet setting, but the focus is for them to be able to deliver the virtual instruction. And that's the priority. So for them to be able to do that where in the setting that is most conducive to them being able to deliver their instruction in an uninterrupted way. We have created links throughout the document, so when you access this online, there are links to some of the materials you'll need. One of them is the acknowledgement of virtual instruction, but if you go through, there are other forms later down and links to those. Very briefly, elementary school virtual classroom learning. Ms. Villarreal, I'm going to ask you in just a second to maybe give a little bit more detail. While this looks like very detailed, it's sort of listed as a sample virtual learning schedule. We're still in conversation to hammer out the specific details of the instructional program in the schools. As you review this hasn't changed dramatically from the virtual learning. This really just captures that we're hitting all the different areas and their specific times based on the age of students. Ms. Villarreal, would you like to touch on anything that might have sort of recent developments with regard to the schedule for our students and teachers in elementary schools?
Yes, hi, this is Renee Villarreal. I'm the Executive Director for Elementary. Right now we are working on a draft for a very specific schedule for our online learning. We have blocks of time for the content areas, all 4 core content areas. And the way we've structured it is, we still have our class meetings in the morning. That would be synchronous, so it would be live. And then our lessons are, we have a whole group time with the teacher and the students, and they're interacting together. They're not on there for long periods of time. It's a short mini lesson. And then students are given opportunities to work based on that. And the teacher would be having flex groups or small groups right after that to support kids. So I really like the way that we've structured the learning, because it is a small mini lesson and then some active work related to that. There are breaks put in very intentionally that will support children at home and our students in the learning centers. And we're still working through that. We have groups of principals and assistant principals that have helped us draft these schedules. They're just not quite ready yet. We have good drafts working, and I think in the next day or two, we'll have finals ready to share. Did you want me to touch on anything else specific, Dr. Bulson?
I think right now that's good. We will come back. If there's more questions from the board, we'll come back to those in just a little bit. All right. Okay, so the middle school schedule, as well as the high school schedule, is a little easier to follow. I think I'm gonna leave Mr. O'Brien alone for a minute, because I think if there's questions specific to that from the board, they can ask. But this is essentially, I mean, the goal here was to create a consistent schedule, a predictable schedule, so people knew what time to access their courses, and the expectation is that we are staying with a consistent schedule, and that will allow us for that predictability for the students. As we've indicated before, this will require a lot of synchronous time with people, but we thought it was important to bias that in this upcoming time of virtual learning. So let's take just a few minutes on the learning support centers. I'm now on page 14 of the document, and I'll move through these. If you can see this. The original intent of learning support centers was to address the needs of students in all of our grades who require a safe place to spend the day. The one thing that could not be delivered in a hybrid model was a place for students to be if they really needed it. They needed a safe place, they needed access to internet, they needed, their parents had to work, they needed supervision. We did not have that available 5 days a week. And in fact, if we had done a hybrid model, we would have been precluded from being able to deliver that for anyone. And so one thing that the learning centers do provide, which a hybrid model would not have done, was that 5 day a week coverage that some of our families absolutely rely on in order to be able to go to work and do that. Now we know that there's still much more to ensure that the experience in the learning centers, and I think a lot of the planning going on to ensure that, so we can ensure the experience in the learning centers is positive and as engaging for students as we can possibly make it. Now, of course, for the parts where synchronous instruction is outlined in the schedules, the teachers will be receiving that synchronous instruction from their teacher, who would be in a virtual environment. And as we've indicated, the families of students with IEPs will have, we'll be working with them to address the needs of those IEPs and reaching out more individually to them. The learning centers, one of the things that I don't think is here, our target for the learning centers is one of the key elements of learning centers. Our target for the learning centers is that we will have 2 adults for every 8 students. The reason for that is the group size guidance, the small group guidance. We are shooting for the target of groups of no larger than 10 per classroom. The reason for 2 adults is very much our effort to deliver on not having individuals who are crossing multiple groups and then creating the potential for sort of cross exposure across groups. So the idea, originally we thought maybe we could do one adult for a small group and then maybe have a person who floats from room to room to make sure the people in those rooms have access to breaks and lunch and those sorts of things, any sort of break that an adult might need somewhere in the course of the day. The idea of having 2 people in there. Now, I think there's still more we can build on to make sure that's engaging. The idea of the small setting allows us to more, I think, more predictably keep the social distancing in place, ensure that the group stays small. And that's one of the key elements, even of the existing CDC guidance still talks to groups staying in one place, staying together, having the students not moving to multiple groups, and allowing for those physical distancing guidelines. And so that's one of the key elements of this plan. And again, we'll test how that works. We'll see if if we're seeing additional infections as a result of the work in those, but I feel pretty confident that we'll be able to manage that and maintain, not be contributing to Harford County's infection rate. In the intention survey, we did ask parents about transportation. We asked parents about access to the food and nutrition. So we will have meals available, we have transportation available. One question that did come out during the comments tonight, the expectation right now, we had 2,519 families indicate 2,519 students scheduled to go into our learning centers. That is what we're planning for right now, and we are starting a waiting list. But for those who did submit, it is our intention to serve all of those students. We are not going to have learning centers in every single school, but we're having learning centers in a large majority of them. Most of our students will be remaining in their communities. We will have a communication out about that at the latest by the end of next week. But in terms of planning purposes, for our families who are waiting to find out if they're going to get in, it is our plan that all of the students who have submitted an application to be in there, that will be supported. So that's where we stand as of today. We don't know, once we get planned for that group of students, if we are able to increase our capacity and add more students down the road. We will absolutely revisit that once we have this group planned for, and then assuring, again, we have the adequate staff in place and the adequate personal protective equipment for everybody. Learning center hours are here. You can read those. Transportation, that has not changed. Again, it's our expectation. It's essentially 1 student per seat. Sanitation, disinfection, all the expectations around cleaning. Food and nutrition. Again, this is a moving target. I want to take just a couple seconds to talk about this. We think we've gotten all the guidance that's coming from the federal government about food and nutrition. Just to remind everybody, we are so reliant. The food and nutrition pretty much survives on the reimbursements we get from the federal government. Thus, we have to follow their rules, and we had a lot of flexibility through the spring. We had a lot of waivers that were granted. In fact, we were able to make some adjustments to provide even more meals. We may not get reimbursed for all of them, but most of them, and we thought it was critical that we supported that. A number of the waivers that were in place for food and nutrition to deliver meals at some of our sites, and there are a number, and I won't go into the details, but just want everyone to hear that some of the procedures are going to have to change as a number of the waivers are expiring on August 31st. So how we deliver meals going into the fall will be slightly different. We will have very clear communication that comes out. We're also going to distribute information about what changes are coming at our existing meal sites, but we're also looking to create hard copy flyers to give out in different settings, so we can look for people to get those before the end of the month. One thing I do want to point out to everyone is one of the things that will change is that the students picking up meals at any meal distribution site, in other words, let me step back for a second. The students in the learning centers will be getting meals in the learning centers. So for all of those that we open, there will be meals there. We believe that our elementary schools will be the external distribution points for people who are staying out of school and staying in a virtual setting but still want to access meals. We will be able to distribute because our schools will be preparing meals for the students who are in the learning centers. Those who are coming to pick up meals who are not coming into school, those who are staying virtual and are did not sign up for a learning center, want to stay virtual but still want to access meals. Currently, what we're seeing with the waivers coming from the government is they will need to be qualified for free and reduced meals, which means they will need to fill out the application. And one thing we have now is we have a new link, we have a new service where you can actually fill out the free and reduced meals application electronically. And so we'll be including the link to that on any future communication that comes out about that. But that's also something that is, again, brand new. We've been waiting to see which waivers would be coming in from the federal government. We had a new one hit last week that was helpful, but again, some of the ones we were hoping would be renewed thus far have not been. So that's just something we just ask people to watch for changes there. Student health guidelines, so the expectation, of course, here is that the students who are coming into our schools, they need to be COVID-free, symptom-free when they come to school. Parents need to keep their children home if they are ill or experiencing any of the symptoms. And this is going to be an expectation. This is also an expectation for our employees and our adults. And there will be monitoring in place. But we also have a decision matrix protocol that has come from the State Department of Health through Maryland State Department of Education that provides some of the details for what happens if we have a positive COVID case in any of our schools, in any of our learning centers. And so there is still the possibility, if there is an infection in a school, in a learning center, that students who had access to a learning center may need to go into a quarantine. So there's still the possibility, if we have these infections, that we will need to follow that closing protocol. Again, details, and in fact, there's a link to that document it's here. If you go to page 19, there's more about student health guidelines, and there are links to the documents that sort of describe the state plan for that. There is also information here. There's another memo that came from MSDE with guidance for cloth face coverings. It's an expectation that students and adults in the learning centers will, wherever possible, be required to wear cloth face coverings. There are some very limited exceptions to that, but for most students, the expectation, and most staff, the expectation will be the cloth face coverings at all time, and that is one of the requirements for being able to access the learning center. One of the conversations, and again, we'll get more detail here, but the immunization requirements, it's a requirement at all times for our students attending school. There is great concern nationally that immunization compliance rates are very low, and there's more to follow, I think, coming from the state, but the expectation is that even students attending school virtually will be expected to have their immunizations up to date. That's something that I think is going to be a great challenge for us to enforce and verify, but it is still it is a requirement in the state of Maryland that the vaccines are up to date. And I think in this time of public health, of all the challenges we're facing, we need to be very vigilant about requiring and ensuring that all of our students get the vaccines they need. Employee health guidelines, again, you can read those. I think these have been consistent with the last plan, but it's very similar. I mean, the short version is our employees cannot report to work if they are experiencing symptoms. And if there was a circumstance where they were found to be positive, we do have a protocol for what circumstances would allow them to return to work. So that's all spelled out there. Additional considerations, I mean, you heard the comments that, the state has postponed interscholastic athletics. That was MPSSAA in coordination with the State Department of Health, the Superintendent's Association, the State Department of Education. And so that is a statewide recommendation. I believe they're going to be discussing more about this at the next State Board of Education meeting. And I know they indicated that there were additional details that may be coming forth with regard to any type of activity. So for example, this summer we did have some in-person conditioning activities with many of the school districts going completely virtual. That's not something that they feel they're in a position to consider, but they're all looking at that. And I think we're going to get more guidance about what types of activities would be acceptable within Maryland. And as, again, one of the districts doing more in-person activity than any of the others here, I think there's a case that could be made for, you know, us doing as much as we can with regard to providing those other types of activities for students outside the school day. But we'll wait till we get more guidance from MSDE on that. Childcare, we are still working with all our providers in town to help facilitate before and after care, particularly in the schools where we have learning centers. So if people need a longer stretch of time, and we have information related to that here and how you can access more on that. Communication and family outreach, you know, we've had a number of trainings going through this year for families information, particularly our parent talks videos that have been out there. We can expect a lot more of that. We have a lot of training outreach to support parents to help them partner with us through all of this, through the virtual instruction. Again, many other things here, community partnerships. We have many different groups we're working with to help support this. Just an indication here, number 5, the large gatherings. I mean, large gatherings are still not allowable at this time in the state, and our learning sports centers won't have large gatherings. Everyone will be very carefully spread out, but we're still not in a place where we're considering assemblies, large events, those types of things. Professional development. I think I shared at the beginning that we've released a lot of details to our staff about the type of training they'll need to receive. You can read a little bit about that here. And again, sort of the basics that need to be in the plan: masks, physical distancing, hand washing, cleaning, sanitization, ventilation, details here, but also knowing that we're working very carefully on those protocols to have that spelled out more carefully in the operational work. So the timeline, these parts haven't changed much. So we said we're going to have to adjust our distribution for technology. But one of the other things that now that we know the Learning Center module, we still need to put out class lists and assignments to teachers and all those things. And those are the types of things that our schools are working closely on. That will be coming. This is just more of a summary of the various groups we have working on this. If you get to page 26, again, we have links to more of the resources, the materials, the memos that people need to access, forms that people may need to fill out that are highlighted in the plan. We have all those links here, and some of them also have live links throughout the document. And on page 28, we have a list of the required school year forms. I won't read that to you. We'll let people they can work through that on their own. We've talked about the glossary of terms in the past, 13 requirements from MSDE, the things that need to be included in the continuity learning plan or the recovery plans, and that is it. So I will stop talking about the plan at this point. This is where we are right now. As I said, things seem to change daily, but I'm certainly open to all of your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bulson. I have a question. May I ask a question?
Yes,
this is Joyce.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I think that it answered many questions, and I tried to follow and check things off that I had on my list. So I'll just start with a couple. Going back to the point about, you talked a lot about asynchronous learning, where teachers will be on a virtual learning space with their entire class. And Renee also talked about the mini lessons and the small groups. My question is, I'm assuming that the entire class will be on one platform simultaneously. Is that right?
I guess it depends on what you mean by platform.
Okay, so if they're on a virtual learning space, okay, in
Yeah.
one virtual setting at once where everyone is gathered together virtually, like we are
Yes.
right now.
Yes, the
Okay.
expectation is all the students will be working together. The students who have, the families or the students who have opted for an asynchronous approach, that will be completely separate. And that was something I mentioned earlier, the idea that that's one of the things we're still sort of like, who is going to deliver, monitor, be in communication with the parents during that. But we have many resources available, and I think so, because there were questions earlier tonight about if a student misses a lesson, can they get the asynchronous stuff? I think if a student misses a lesson, just like if they miss any lesson, we have the materials to be able to give them, they would get that from their teacher, but that wouldn't cause them to switch over to the asynchronous part, because again, those groups will be treated differently. So students who are in the synchronous would get their resources directly from their teacher. The asynchronous will be working on, again, those will be sent out by staff, but they won't be, students in one group won't be toggling back and forth between the two.
Okay, understood. Now, thinking in terms of attendance, I did hear the point about, and this was a question from a lot of parents that I received, that the board has received. In terms of attendance, you answered the question about how teachers are to be tracking, presence in their virtual space, and how students will gather and attendance will be captured via Student Access Center. Okay, so now taking into account technical barriers, right? Issues with passwords not working spontaneously, connectivity issues. How is that? I guess my question is, how do we intend to be fair to students and their attendance in light of those very real barriers that, not only do we experience them now, but we experience them in the spring?
Attendance is always a challenge, even in a regular time when we're all in person. And so I think we still have to remain flexible, because the uncertainties of the digital environment, I think, will create times when I think we have very reasonable things where a student either gets bumped off, needs to come back on. So this is, I think, like everything that we're working with in the digital environment, this is something that we're going to have a little flexibility with, but at the same time, we still need that best effort on all fronts for students to be logging in, and that's, the teachers need to see them there. And if they're not, just as if they missed a class for another reason, that needs to be a conversation with the staff.
Okay, and then the other question I have in this lens is with regards to printed packets. I think you mentioned something about it, but this was another valid concern because printers don't always work. I think that one of the surveys that the administration took early on was a concern about having access to a printer at all. So will the students be receiving printed packets from the schools to help guide instruction and to supplement some of the virtual learning they'll be doing?
I don't believe there is a plan to regularly deliver printed packets, but let me sort of kick that question over to Dr. Susan Brown, because they've been working on the materials, and we know there may be in some cases a need for printed packets, but the expectation with the devices that the students will be able to complete, because again, this isn't a situation where we're expecting students to work on phones, which is one of the issues we had in the past, that the students should be able to work in a remote environment. But Dr. Brown, do you want to add to that at all?
Good evening, everyone. Yes, we really are looking towards not using printed packets for our students in the upcoming school year. That our expectation is that all teachers would use the It's Learning platform, and within the It's Learning platform, there's a playlist, and within that playlist is where all the content, the curriculum, the pacing charts, and the critical content maps are in there for not only for the students but also for the families. We are looking. There are a few exceptions. So, for instance, with our pre-K students, we do know that we need to create some materials for them. So we're working on doing just that for that population. But other than that, the expectation would be that we would not be creating packets moving forward, in the upcoming school year. If we do need to create packets, we would do so very similarly to the way we did it last school year at the very end of the school year. So at the very beginning of the shutdown, the packets were very generic and very broad. By the end of the school year, we had individualized the packets for each individual student based on their current schedule, relating to exactly the content that they were learning individually. So if that does happen, if we do have to pivot or create some materials for them, we would do so in a very individualized nature and make sure that they would get to the students, to the families.
Thank you. I have one last question. I just have to ask about special needs. Thank you for answering some of the questions. Let me follow up by asking this question. So we've had a few weeks since the rollout of the entirely virtual learning lens here. And there was mention about circling back to the parents whose students have IEPs. Has no contact been made with the families yet?
Let me,
Sorry.
let me ask. Go ahead. I was going to turn it over to you. Have at it, Mr. Thatcher.
Yeah, this is Mr. Thatcher again. As of right now, our 10-month staff, special education staff, are not working over the summer, other than the teachers who just finished with virtual ESY services. So our plans right now are being developed for the implementation of the IEP and an alignment of instruction along with those IEP services, so that our professional development that's coming up at the end of August, this is where this plan will be rolled out, and similar to that month that it took for all case managers in the county to make contact with the 5,000 families, that is going to occur again in the month of September and in early October for that very plan. So no, our special education families have not been contacted for the purpose of talking about ending the IDLP and starting up the individualized education program that will occur when school is back in session.
Okay, and so I'm assuming that as you make contact with parents whose students have IEPs within that, starting in September, that the determination for in-person contact and communication and supports will be determined at that time?
Yes, as far as the in-person supports, you're talking about the students who are in the learning support centers. There are no face-to-face supports in homes or anything in as far as virtual learning. So all specially designed instruction is going to be delivered virtually at the start of the year. The superintendent made very clear in his decision, and the final paragraph of his letter sent out to all staff and all parents on July 16th outlines that when it's safe, that we'll be incrementally providing additional in-person experiences. And he ends with, particularly for the students with the greatest learning needs. But our plans right now are twofold. One, making sure that we have staff in the buildings for parents who elected to send their students to school and to be able to access instruction in a safe environment, and so that they can access the virtual learning. As far as home, that's when our parents and our case managers are going to work together to come up with that partnership so that their students can access that instruction as well. The good news is hopefully we'll have most of our parents and most of our students with those devices, and our synchronous learning and the curriculum that supports that will also be in place, and then we will align that instruction with the IEP.
Understood. Thank you.
So have you completed your questions and comments, Dr. Harrell?
I have many more, but I'm going to yield to my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay. Let's do this. For the first round, we'll follow, just to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. We'll follow this order. We'll start with Dr. Bauer. Dr. Harrell, you can go. You're next, unless you've asked your questions. Ms. Karwacki, Dr. Mueller, Dr. Phillips, Ms. Riccardi, Ms. Rush, Ms. Bailey, Ms. Gautier, and then myself. So we'll start with you, Dr. Bauer.
I'll ask one question for this round, which is, I know before we didn't yet have enough staff members selected to fully staff the learning support centers. Is there a concern about having them fully staffed come September 8th or so?
That is kind of the priority work right now. We put out the request for people to do that. We're looking first to do this with people who are willing to opt in. We're looking at other populations. One of the harder realities we're confronting is that we will need to compel some people, probably, and we'll need to be looking at who has assignments that can't be done from home. And so it is our expectation to staff those. Right now we are on track to do that, but we still have more to do to make sure we have enough people. But that's something we're committed to, reaching conclusions or, coming up with solutions for.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Harrell, you've had the first round. Ms. Karwacki.
Yes, thank you. I do have a couple of questions, and Mr. Thatcher, you can probably answer these for me. I've been getting a lot of communications from parents of children with special needs who have needs that require their placement in our Thrive centers. And I was disappointed to hear that the IEP meetings are not going to be initiated until September. It's critical for the parents of our kids to know what their status is going to be. We have a lot of families who are single parent families or two wage earners in the family, and their children may also receive additional services beyond what the school system is offering. And those, like doctor appointments, also have to be scheduled in. How are we addressing those kinds of needs?
Yes, Ms. Garwacki, this is Mr. Thatcher again. I'm sorry if I intimated in my response that IEP services aren't delivered virtually until those parent meetings occur. What I'm suggesting is we were operating last spring with a plan called a distance learning plan, which was based on the IEP. What I'm suggesting is day one, when those case managers have the responsibility of implementing the IEP, whether that be a related service provider, if a student is receiving speech services only, or a case manager in a school building who services students in a collaborative class with a general education teacher, whether that student gets specially designed instruction in an intervention, or whether that student is a Strive student. It's going to require the cooperation in a virtual model of the parents sharing their concerns and desires, and the teacher being able to complement that. And it's not necessarily an IEP meeting. It's a communication between the parent and the teacher. But the IEP is going to be I'm sorry, I was getting some feedback. The IEP is going to be implemented on September 8th.
Okay, and then in the presentation, well, in the plan, John Archer School is going to be a learning support center site, correct?
Yes, anything
And
that's
will that be limited to only students who are currently enrolled at John Archer School?
The specific answer to that question is a little difficult because we have rolling enrollment of students who aren't even living in our state yet, who could show up on Monday, and an IEP determination could be that they could have the services of if that's what the IEP team determines is the least restrictive environment for that student. However, because the learning support centers were offered to all students in Harford County as an option, they were certainly offered to all students at John Archer as an option as well. And so because of the unique needs, some of the physical, social, emotional, and behavioral needs of some of our students, as you mentioned, in programs like Strive, or students that are serviced at John Archer School, there may be specialized folks that need to be there to be able to provide those access to some of the virtual learning that's going to occur.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure that we were not, that the John Archer site was for our students with the most significant needs. So there were, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So yes, the parents of the students in the Strive program that will be contacted before school begins. Am I correct in saying that?
I believe all students will be contacted that elected to go to the learning support centers before school begins.
Okay, and our students who are enrolled in Strive programs that have very significant needs also, some of our children in the program I know are more severely on the autism spectrum and have significant needs as well. They will, whether or not they're in a learning support center, will those parents also be contacted? There's a lot of angst and anxiety out there.
Yes, there is. And I hope that you hear that we are thinking about this, and we have some plans. Many of them are difficult to answer with a broad brush because our students are all served by individualized education programs. So it's difficult to respond specifically. But I will say that we have been garnering a lot of questions. I recently contacted our Special Education Citizens Advisory Council, and as of today, they have sent me a list of some concerns and questions. And one of the things that I'd like to announce tonight is that we are going to have a virtual town hall meeting to address some of those questions and some live questions on the 19th. I believe that is Wednesday, August 19th, and that's going to be advertised in short order so that we can address this. It was a quick turnaround, but we thought it was very necessary to be able to partner with our Citizens Advisory Council and be able to offer that so that we can get down to some more specific questions and have some of my coordinators who are closer to the work be able to respond to some of those questions.
Well, thank you for doing that. I know that there will be a lot of parents who will appreciate that opportunity. That's all the questions I have for now.
Thank you, Ms. Kowacki. Dr. Mueller.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. One is there seems to be a lot of concern with parents about how many hours of screen time their children are going to have with the virtual learning. And I know you gave us that general schedule, but that really didn't tell me, you know, how much time at each level they'll be spending on the screen with their teachers as opposed to how much is individual time. But that does seem to be one of the areas that a lot of parents are concerned with.
All right, so it's a little different. I think the elementary schedule,
that gives me a little better picture.
Yeah, that has more detail. So why don't I actually, so for the sake of middle and high school, because like I said, the elementary one, I think the synchronous time is laid out by grade level and sort of age, what people can expect. So Mr. O'Brien, would you talk a little bit about middle and high school?
I can. Good evening, everybody. So the goal is to provide excellent instruction every period of every day. And we know it's going to take some getting used to because teachers aren't used to teaching this way and students aren't used to learning this way. So our goal really is to blend both the synchronous instruction, the on-screen time with individualized work, with collaborative work, independent work, to make sure that we really have well-rounded and engaged lessons. We know that whether you're a 6th grader or a 12th grader, you can't engage a student for a long period of time in the same kind of activity, whether they're on a screen or in a textbook. So our goal is to really provide excellent pedagogy each lesson that involves on-screen time and not. If you take a course like physical education, it might only be 10% on screen and 90% off screen during a lesson. Well, another like an AP physics class that's not lab based might have just the opposite, 90% on screen, 10% off screen. So it's going to really be a blend. And again, our direction to teachers is to really develop lessons that engage kids. And to do that, they're going to have to really be mindful of their screen time.
I appreciate that. And again, I think a lot of the questions that I'm getting from parents are just because this is unknown. It's something new. It's something different. They're asking questions about, is there going to be training for the parents with the technology so that they'll be able to help their students? And I think this is more geared towards the elementary parents, but they want to know, you know, am I going to know how to operate this system so that I can help my students with it? So will there be training for parents on the technology?
So let me try to think who best to have answer that. Is that Jackie? Is that something you can help with?
Sure, I can help. Good evening. My name's Jackie Tarbert. I'm the Director of Organizational Development. And so your question about our parents and being able to provide that training for our parents in order to support their students. Yes, we are planning for some hard documents that people can access, some videos that our families will be able to access in order to have that orientation to the learning management system. How do they access the curriculum and access the instructional materials, as well as how to troubleshoot and figure out what to do if they have any trouble at home. So Mary Beth Stapleton and a team, we're working together in order to plan that orientation, plan those materials, and to be able to provide that for our community.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate that. The other question, and then I'll yield to the next person. I've had questions, of course, about when they could pick up the Chromebooks, but we kind of got that answered today. But they also want to know, like in the past, they've always had lists of school supplies, things they needed to buy. And so I've had communications from parents being concerned they haven't gotten a list. When are they going to be able to go out and buy the things that they need for their children? Is there going to be a list? That type of thing. So if someone could help me with that.
Ms. Villarreal, is that something, because that tends to be more of a elementary school question with regard to supply lists. Is that something that you guys have discussed?
We have, and yes, there are some school supply lists out published now. However, we are looking at those, and we might add to those or tweak those a little because Harford County Public Schools will be providing quite a few materials for children at home, like bags of manipulatives and different things like that. So supply list, if they haven't been published yet for an individual school, that's coming very soon. We have groups of principals working through that now, but some have already planned for that and published it. So there are a few that are probably still remaining. So they'll be coming in the next few days. And what we are working on now is working with school teams to make sure they know all the materials that will be coming to their buildings. And then our school teams will be working to organize those materials into bags for each student. And then when we do have the pickup time at the end of August, children will be able to come in and pick up all those materials that we will be providing. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and yield. I have a few other questions, but I'd like to come back to them.
Okay, so going in order of who's next, we've heard from Dr. Bauer and Dr. Mueller and Dr. Harold. I believe the next person up is going to be, Dr. Phillips. Do you have any questions, sir?
Just one. First of all, I just want to say that everything that's going on behind the scenes kind of reminds me of a NASA space flight. All the preparation is being done. I'm talking specifically with the learning centers. All the preparation is being done, but you never really know whether the ship's going to get off the ground until liftoff. So it's going to be interesting to see what finally happens when the pedal hits the metal. But in regards to the learning centers, assuming there are no health snags along the way, I see the potential for interest in these learning centers expanding almost exponentially. I know a lot of patients of mine, they're off until September 30th, working from home, I should say, till September 30th. The importance of that date is the end of the fiscal year, the new fiscal year starting October 1. Assuming that some of these parents may have to go back to work at that point, if maybe not, but maybe that's going to be the start of a new year for them. How fluid can we be to be able to accommodate the changing needs of families, people that may have to go back to work in the middle of the semester? Are we going to prepare to have more than the 600 plus adults that we need to staff the learning centers, or are we just going to try to get to the bare minimum and then stop at that point? Because I foresee that could become an issue where people are going to want to get into them, and we're not going to have the resources to allow them in.
Right. That's a great question. Our hope is to be able to expand the capacity to meet the demand, but we first need to meet the demand we have in place right now. I think there's some variables that could affect how we staff the schools. I think we might find that while some people express their intentions that we actually don't have as many coming as signed up, and so we might have capacity available fairly quickly if we have no shows and that sort of things. Once we hit the mark of being able to deliver on the staffing we have based on the initial number that we're working with, we're not going to stop. We're going to try to continue growing that capacity. There's a couple things that I think we need to be looking at, which is as we demonstrate that we can do this safely and that we can do this without exposing people to greater risk of infection. or at least that we're doing it in such a way that that's a very minimal concern. We'll kind of get two things. I'm expecting, as you indicated, we might get more demand, but I also believe that convincing, like I said, we wanted to do this initially with staff who opt in, but like I said, we also may find ourselves in a place to compel people. The challenge is, who do we have available to do that, and what do we have in the way of resources to support that? So, short answer, we're going to try to keep up with the demand. We're going to try to meet the need. I do think, some other questions that may come into play here is if we see that the ratio we're targeting 8 to 2, and we're not seeing any change in infection rates or transmission, that would be a conversation where I might return to the health department and say, how comfortable are we going to 10 to 2 or 12 to 2? Because if we can still deliver on the physical distancing expectations in the classrooms, we may have the capacity to grow our offering that way. But again, I think we'll need to reassess that once we've had a chance to see if we are able to avoid growing the community transmission in these settings. And so I think there's a number of variables that can come to play. So the basic commitment is we will absolutely be flexible in trying to grow this and meet the demand. Because at the same time, as I indicated, we're going to be looking for those ways we can deliver more in-person experiences beyond just the learning center.
Just one more quick question, or maybe it may not be quick. Let's say one child, I assume the learning center, they're going to be a self-contained, I think you said they're going to be a self-contained pod or bubble. Let's say one child in a learning center becomes ill. I assume that pod will be shut down for 2 weeks. Am I correct in assuming that will be the only room in that school that will be shut down, or will that be, will the entire school be shut down?
I think there's a lot of variables that could come to play there. I see Mary Nasuda is on the call, and I also think I saw Katie Ridgway, but Mary or Katie, either of you, I think, could answer this question. So.
Certainly, thank you. This is Mary.
Okay.
Mary Nasuda, I'm the Supervisor of Health Services, and we're going to be following the decision made from the Maryland Department of Health. And so when we look at finding a person who has COVID, a positive case through laboratory confirmation or by a COVID-like illness, and we have those symptomologies already mapped out for us, then we would be excluding that person and anybody who was considered a close contact. And that's that prolonged close contact of 15 minutes, 6 feet. So chances are that would be that entire cohort, since they'll be spending time together during the day. But we would then do contact tracing with the health department to ensure that no one else also was in that close contact, and then would work with them to create that quarantine pod of 14 days.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips.
That's all for me.
Thank you. Ms. Riccardi?
Thank you, President Robinson. I do have a number of questions. I'm going to continue with what Dr. Phillips just said, if you don't mind, Mary. So I have a student who is, and there's an issue, whether it's a teacher or student in a pod that has an issue which is going to require that pod to be quarantined, and they have a brother or sister in 2 other schools and 2 other grades that is from that same family. What happens?
Well, you bring up the real problem with contact tracing. Contact tracing can be quite complicated and complex, and we're not going to be making those decisions in a vacuum. We're going to be using the Communicable Disease Department of the Health Department to help us make those decisions. Generally, a contact of a contact is not a problem, but each of those cases will be looked at, and because there'll be a school nurse in every learning center, she'll be that point person to work with the communicable disease nurses to determine how far that quarantine would need to spread. But generally, again, not making those decisions on our own. Contacts of contacts are generally not a problem, but we'll be looking at symptomology where this person may have come in contact, if there are other kids who have other similar experiences where they may have all been in the same place. So each of those will have a pretty high level of individual investigation, and it will be done in concert with our local health department.
I appreciate that. And I was referring to like family members that would be a lot closer than just contact, but I
Sure.
understand what you're saying.
Yeah, each of those will be looked at separately, but just because a person who's a contact of a contact, that doesn't mean that then that sort of contact of a contact of a contact. We got into this when we were when we closed in March. You know, it sort of becomes this big chain, and so each of these will be looked at quite individually, and we'll be using all of the expertise of our communicable disease nurses. Our nurses have worked with them for years in outbreak investigation, so we'll be continuing that same relationship.
And it's great. I just saw a family member more close than just a contact of a contact, but I appreciate what you're saying and thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, my next question. I understand we have 2,500 and some students that will be attending the learning centers as a result of our request for intention that was sent out. What was the total number of respondents to the letter of intention? Not just that they want a certain, I'm looking for those who did and did not want. So what was that total response rate? Number, I should say.
Ricardi, this is Eric Davis, Chief of Administration. That number was 15,958. Got that number today from our program evaluation specialist, Usman and Yakuba.
Thank you. So we had about 13,500 that chose to do virtual learning out of that response group, which leaves us to another 23,000, if my math's correct, that we did not get a response from. Is that correct? And if families, I can't really use the students, but we still don't know about those 23,000 students of what their intention is, correct?
That would be correct if they did not respond to the survey, but it was an opt-in for.
Right. No, I understand that. I guess my concern is that so school starts and we have 23,000 students whose parents somehow missed the communication, did not participate, did not see that we're going to be absent from the media, and the child is at the bus stop and arrives at school. I mean, what's the plan? Because we've really only have the capacity of those who, I mean, that I'm assuming that may very well happen. What is our plan to address those students who show up for school not realizing that there was an opt-in choice?
That question actually came up at our Learning Center Task Force meeting, and actually Ms. Kathy Bendis, who has been doing an outstanding job with the program of the transportation, has really been looking at that with the routes for the first couple of weeks of school, because we're anticipating that very thing. So I'm going to have Ms. Bendis share with you a little bit about that plan.
Thank you.
Good evening. This is Kathy Bendis, Director of Transportation. Our plan would be that if there's a student at a stop, like we would typically do, the student will be picked up and will be transported to school. We will have buses staged in various locations throughout the county to ensure that if there is a student who needs to be returned home, that we'll work with the schools to support those efforts and make sure that they're actually transported home directly. So that would be our plan if there is a student who would happen to come into school and the school not be prepared for them.
And then subsequent communication with the family, and that kind of foots to what again Dr. Phillips was referring to, where we may be in a situation where the parent is working and has no choice and needs to opt in. I mean, I could see where we could be significantly underserviced in our capabilities of these learning centers. We will know that very well, obviously, after the first week of school, but this could really put a monkey wrench in things. So
I can speak from the transportation perspective that we would be prepared to serve the capacities that we've allotted for, which would be 1 student per seat. However, I'm not certain on the school side of things and what that capacity looks like.
No, I understand, but I'm just throwing that out. It could be a capacity question. Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you. I have a question with regard to devices. I know that we said we had a back order of 15,000 devices. It's kind of amazing. Everything always is the fault of COVID. Don't you love it when it seems to be the easy blame? And I'm not talking about the school system. I'm talking about manufacturing, and every problem we have now is because of COVID. But anyway, needless to say, we have a back order of 15,000 devices. What's the plan to identify which families will get the devices while we're waiting for the next group of devices to come in? And do we have a tentative date for delivery on the remaining devices?
Okay, I'll take that one, and Mr. Moore might be able to jump in, but I have a sense that he didn't get a lot more information. So he learned today that, and the specific number was 14. I just circled it. 14,688 of the devices we ordered do not have all the parts in the country at the moment to be assembled for us. We do not, as of today. Mr. Moore has a call scheduled tomorrow with Dell, with our supplier, and apparently he's been moved up the chain to kind of a higher level person at the company to get more answers related to that. So in terms of when we might expect them, if we get any estimates, I could share that with you. We don't know that. So to the first part of your question, what's the plan? So in the spring, we gathered a lot of data in a number of different ways. It was one of the things we had the teachers help us with, which was identifying which students needed to go more asynchronous, which students needed to have packets shipped to them because they didn't have the technology capacity to engage in any sort of online instruction in the spring. So we have a list of students who weren't able to get to access any learning online. So that's where we start. We start by going back to that list of students who we already know had connectivity or device issues. We have a couple of, that data is our starting point. We also will then start looking at, again, we can go back and sort of reaching out to anyone particularly free and reduced, so we have a lot of information about who might need them. So we start with students who need it the most. We can then create a circumstance where we may have to have people request them if they don't have what they need in the beginning. And so, that's the plan as of right now, how we address the fact that we're going to be short such a significant number of devices. But again, that was information that came to me about 2:30 this afternoon. And so we will have more plans on that to make that more targeted as we go through this week a little bit.
When will the 15,000 be delivered? Do we have an idea?
The ones that
that more than 23,000 or 24,000. The remaining. Oh no, it wasn't that many. How many are remaining for elementary? Because that's right, the elementary is only getting the Chromebooks.
Right now we ordered a little over 27,000 Chromebooks.
Okay.
We're expecting about 13,000 of them to come in, and we have, I forget what the total number is, about 11,000 devices for high school that are devices we've reconditioned. So those are the ones we already owned. So the high school students, the plan there was to provide the laptops, those that we already owned, to the high school students, and then Chromebooks for K through 8.
So how many are we short?
We're short that number, that 14,688 is the number we're short. The other, so we're expecting the 13,000 in. Those are due in the third week of August, so at the end of next week. And then I believe we don't have a projection on a delivery date for that 14,688.
All right. I know that there's a problem with internet connectivity in the different parts of the county. It really is going to be the responsibility of the parent, or if the child is going to do virtual learning and not go to a learning center, it's going to be their responsibility to get to a location that has connectivity during the day. Otherwise, the children will not be serviced because they don't have connectivity, correct?
partly. I think a lot of the responsibility still rests with the families here. This is maybe where I tap Mr. Moore, because with regard to the grant funds we have coming for connectivity, I know we have one of the things we are looking at is hotspots. We have a certain number of them purchased. But Mr. Moore, do you want to add any more detail on that?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Bulson. And Mr. Carty, you're absolutely correct. The northern end of the county, the eastern side, moving down towards the that Churchville area is our most problematic in terms of vendors that supply addresses with broadband connectivity. We did apply for a grant through the Governor's Office of Rural Broadband. We were just informed today that we did receive funding. That funding will purchase enough hotspots for all those addresses that have been identified by the FCC as having no ability to get broadband access. That number is approximately 383 addresses in Harford County with students that live at those addresses. Now, I will caution you and those in the audience that are listening that many of those areas in the northern end of the county, due to geographic and topographic challenges, even a hotspot is not going to work. And most recently, we received an email from a family that they do not have broadband. They have tried hotspots, but their location gets no cellular signal. So in that case, we have no additional service that we can provide to the family, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you. I have one more question. Sorry, let me just pull it up here. So we have, if we look at with the student group with federally mandated IEPs, and I'm talking about the students that are not part of the John Archer community, but there are students that are in the schools that have one-on-one support, that really virtual learning is not going to work. I don't know what percentage of those students are part of the group that have requested student learning centers, but we have families that are going to have to quit their job to stay home with these kids, and it's just going to be devastating for them. I guess my question is, if a student has a federally mandated IEP, what are we going to do to support them if they go to a student learning center?
This is Mike Thatcher. The decision for the least restrictive environment for the fall was made by the superintendent, and it was virtual. However, there was also an addition of learning support centers for a safe place for students to attend and have access to Wi-Fi should the parents make that election. We all know that there is a wide range of supports that are required for students to be able to access instruction. And while our specially designed instruction is going to be delivered virtually, there are some support services that some students require, some physical supports, some emotional supports, some social supports, and even some behavioral supports based on their IEP. The access for those have to be delivered in the Learning Support Center if those students are coming to those centers. The direct teaching, however, is going to be virtual for the start in the fall. In the superintendent's communication, and while this will not necessarily begin on September 8th, is as soon as possible and when it is safe, we are going to get up and running small groups, services for small groups of students particularly those with the greatest learning needs, and that is what we were charged with. But I will be totally honest with you here and say that our work right now is working with our curriculum partners in Susan Brown's office to ensure that we are going to deliver the professional development that's needed for our new teachers and our existing special education staff so that they can deliver virtual instruction, and also fulfilling the request of the superintendent to have learning support centers open for our students. It will be a great challenge, Patrice, and we are holding some IEP meetings over the summer where we have some students that have great needs and we have to address those. But the fact of the matter is we are having a virtual start for those reasons that the superintendent outlined, and those are the two big things that we're planning for now.
And is there any movement to have the IEP meeting start before September the 8th, where we have the information to try to give these parents information that they need?
We have been holding IEP meetings all summer, and we continue to do so. What I'm suggesting to you is, though, we have to do what's reasonable in light of the circumstances. And I'm also charged with judiciously utilizing the funds we have to be able to pay staff to come in. And I have to be very careful about the way we utilize those funds. But the first supports are, if we need to have an IEP meeting, that is decided upon by the school, and then we staff it and pay the folks appropriately to come in and be able to hold that IEP meeting. I was at an IEP meeting just the other day. We continue to have central IEP meetings and school-based IEP meetings even as we speak.
So the parents that decide the virtual will not have the support services in their home. They would only have those services if they had requested a learning center.
I'm not saying that the virtual supports are going to be void at all. In fact, there are many students who access special education where some of the supports can be delivered in a virtual environment. And I started this whole conversation with one of the first questions that was asked. I believe it was by Ms. Rush, talking about the delivery of IEP services, and very specifically in the spring of last year, we did not go with a plan to follow the IEP strictly. We decided to do what we call the distance learning plan, because there were so many extreme situations where some students were, or some families were dealing with sick family members, and school, quite frankly, was the last thing on their mind. We had connectivity issues. We're still talking about those today just because of the setup of our county. And we had others that could focus on learning and were able to assist and work with the special education teacher to be able to deliver that instruction. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. I'm going to defer next. I think Tamara, she next.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll keep beating on Mr. Thatcher. Sorry. So I understand. Thank you for explaining what you have thus far. So that we've got 10-month special ed staff that are not even back to work yet. So when they are back to work, how long before you believe that all of our families with IEPs will be contacted and have a plan just to move forward, just to make sure they're all contacted and have a plan?
Okay, well, just to begin, the IEP is the plan.
Thank you. Yes.
So I'm not correcting you. I don't want parents to think that the special education staff won't be guided. That is the document that guides those. Just like the 15,000 families that didn't respond to the survey, our staff will still be holding those synchronous sessions, and our school system will be making contact for students who don't log on to try to get connectivity. Same for parents who don't reach out to us and parents we don't get to on the first day. That IEP will guide instruction, and those case managers will have those lists. Even brand new special educators who have not worked in our system, one of the first things that they learn to access is the Maryland Online IEP system. And we have support folks that help walk them through that process, even if they were trained in a different state and aren't familiar with Maryland Online IEP. And that is the way they become intimately aware of the students and the student needs. And then when they go to their professional development with the curricular training, they learn how they're going to dovetail their specially designed instruction to deliver those services. How long will it take to contact them? I can only tell you that it took about a month to contact every parent to not modify, but to design the distance learning plan.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. I did not mean to say there was not a plan. The word plan means more than one thing. Sorry about that. You're absolutely. So you think it'll be so maybe approximately a month before we have all the understanding of the requirements for the students with IEPs in order to make sure they can do learning remotely?
I'm just suggesting there may be some amendments. For example, when you deliver some instruction face-to-face and you have a service that is a half an hour with an elementary school student.
Yep.
I'm not suggesting in any way that we'd be reducing those services, but the delivery in a virtual model might be different. Perhaps the attention to the screen may only be 15 minutes. So we might do 2 15-minute sessions virtually instead of the half an hour. Those are decisions that are going to be made not by the director, but by the IEP process and the people that are the closest to the students. I remember when I was a special education teacher at Edgewood High School back in 1988, and I did not have the director of special education or even my principal dictating IEP services. I took those services that were based in the IEP and I delivered those and had intimate conversations with my families and students.
Thank you. So I understand this, Mr. Thatcher, off the hook for now, but we've set ourselves a date of January. Ideally, we're saying we're going to be virtual until January. What's our plan to start to provide or start moving towards? Have we given up and said we're not going to do anything until January? Or is there potential, and what are we looking at now in order to start bringing students back into the classroom potentially earlier than January?
Okay. If we could let Mr. Thatcher catch his breath for a second. So I think there's a lot of things working against us, and I think the time is going to move very quickly. We absolutely have to keep planning to bring our students back, and that's always part of the thinking. But just a conversation today. I had a conversation today with Dr. Moy to ask some questions related to that, because I was asking a little bit, with the changing. With our health officer. For those who don't know Dr. Moy, he's been a fantastic resource to us. But one of the things you've heard me talk a little bit about tonight is we get the learning centers stood up, we get them staffed, we get them operating, and then we can assess the impact of those learning centers. Are we, as we expect, able to deliver them in a safe enough environment that we're not contributing to any sort of community spread and those sorts of things? Of course, also we're looking at what's happening with the rest of COVID. Have our numbers trended down? But the thinking is, once we get these stood up, we're not going to know if they've had an impact on community transmission of the virus for a few weeks, because there's always a lag with the numbers. And so an expectation that while we can be planning throughout that time to think of how we might bring one more group and how we'll do that, that planning will be ongoing. But I think, after a few weeks, we're going to see what the impact has been. Then if we can start the idea of doing anything more in person. But I do think the time's going to move quickly. The first quarter ends, I believe the first quarter ends in the first week of November. It's usually end of October, beginning of November, but this year we're starting a little later. So I think we'll find ourselves at the end of the first quarter very quickly. The other thing that impacts this is we don't know if flu season is just going to complicate things. If we're going to be seeing whether we're having sort of false concerns about who has flu and who's, because the symptoms are part of the protocol where we're looking at whether we need to be closing down settings. And so I'm worried about the complications that will bring. With luck, that'll be a lighter season this year. So the point is, those sorts of things will be complicating. The planning will be all along to see, because my hope is, and what you see other districts planning for, is incrementally bringing back small groups. Those conversations will be ongoing throughout the fall, and I'm hoping we're seeing more of those, but we'll add those as we can. But then we do know we're going to need, one of the things we were waiting for, I mean, I think it still says in the MSD document that, details related to stage 3 will come later. And I don't know what's coming with regard to that, but I'm aware that there is some planning afoot. I just don't know what details are going to be released, but I think if there's more clarity about what stage 3 could look like, that will guide us a little bit in what more of a full return to instruction. And with luck, we will be able to do that beginning the second semester, but if there's a chance to do it sooner, we will certainly be watching that and tracking those numbers.
Thank you. That concludes my questions, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. Ms. Bailey.
Yes, so I just had a question. In terms of classes that are happening at Harford Community College, of students that are either participating in part-time or just taking classes at HCC in general, is there any update as to how that'll look for those who are participating in those classes?
I'm going to ask Mr. O'Brien to help with that. I know he's been working on that.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Hi, Phoebe. Very good question. So we have approximately 80 kids a week currently still applying for dual enrollment and college credit classes. So this week, students are invited to pick up laptops at their home school if they're dually enrolled or taking college level classes.
Yeah.
And we're moving full steam ahead. There is a orientation set up with Harford Community College, which you can also find on our website and theirs. So we're full steam ahead, and we should have more dually enrolled students this year, since we're all virtual, than we had last year. So it's very promising, and any questions that any family member should have, reach out to the building level principal, and they can help give you updates or anything regarding any options for seniors this year.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I just had one last question in terms of what was the update on when it came to hotspots around the county?
Okay, I think Mr. Moore touched on that. I'll try to. So again, we learned, was it just today, I believe, that our grant had been approved for that. So we have a number of hotspots. We're looking first at those addresses we know do not have access to broadband. And then behind that, within that group, we're looking at who are those who've qualified for free and reduced meals as our first priority for providing hotspots, so that we can, subsidize that in those settings. As other people indicate, they may not have access to internet. We might look at other solutions also, as in, what's available from some of the internet providers. There've been some low-cost solutions there. But right now, the hotspots, as we just learned about the grant, and so I think Mr. Moore earlier mentioned the number. I don't remember the number offhand, but we believe that grant will support a significant number of hotspots.
383, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. That's all from me this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Ms. Gaudier.
Good evening again, everyone. One of the reasons I like going last is because half of my questions get answered, but there are still more to be asked. First of all, I really do want to take a minute and just say thank you, because I think that in all of the upset about this happening, we are forgetting that there are countless numbers of people in our executive staff, our 12-month employees, our principals, our 12-month teachers, our executive directors, who have done a tremendous amount of work trying to essentially recreate an entire school system online that will be effective for the maximum amount of people possible. The very fact that they're able to do this, and the fact that we're even talking about learning centers, I want to make sure that we point out that, you know, there's 24 jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, and none of them, absolutely not a single one, are doing anything like the learning centers. We're it. So when the people complain and say we're not doing anything and we're not considering, you know, the working families, I would like to point out that we are in fact doing far more than anyone else in our state is. So it is something to consider. We're doing our very best, and we have some very talented, very professional, very outside the box thinkers in our organization who have taken any suggestion they can get, literally from people in grocery store parking lots, and have tried to run with it to make the best thing they can for our kids and our staff. So, you know, I just want to point out that this is not happening without all of them. And I greatly, greatly appreciate what you all have done. And I there's just not enough words for me to say that. So pointing out those things, I also want to ask a couple of questions. In terms of what Ms. Riccardi was asking, what are we doing to find our kids? Which sounds kind of dumb, but when you sit there and you say, we're missing 23,000 kids that we didn't get answers about, what are we doing? You know, typically at the beginning of the year, we'll send out some PPWs and we'll go track some folks down, and we'll do some of those things. That becomes a little sketchier in this day and age, and I understand that. But what kind of outreach are we doing? I know that we had people, and this was something else we didn't advertise but was done. We were concerned about the lack of answers we received from certain zip codes, certain groups of people that we just hadn't heard anything from in terms of responses about the learning centers. And we sent staff out. Dr. Bulson sent staff out to the food sites, the food and nutrition sites, to ask people, you know, had they answered it? Can we help them with that? What's your thought about this? Hey, here's what it is. Because I think it's important that a lot of people remember we do have families that are struggling. And I don't just mean struggling. I know I made my comment about the storm in the boat, and it's all kind of a different thing for all of us, but there is and you know, I know Dr. Stanton would be able to kind of chime in with this. There is something to be said about day-to-day concerns when you have people that are living in poverty. When we talk about reaching the farm students first, it's because we know there's a problem. We know there's a concern. We know there's possibly food insecurity. We know there's possibly insecurity about, electricity, about things like internet. There are some parents in our county, and I am going to point it out because I think it's really, really important, that are struggling every single day with poverty. And they are not thinking about September 8th. They're thinking about, do I have enough food in this house to feed my children tomorrow? What are we going to do because they're supposed to cut off my lights? You know, they're concerned about what happens when things expire and perhaps they don't have a roof over their children's head. There are some more immediate concerns. So my question with all of that is, what are we doing to reach the folks that we have not yet reached? What kind of things are we doing to reach our kids?
Okay, I'm going to thank you for that, and thank you for the comments, for the preliminary comments for that. A lot has been going on. I mean, the work in the spring, having people call, having people reach out, finding different ways. We had these concerns that there were a lot of people we were struggling to reach. Out of 38,000, approximately 38,000 students, by the time we got to the end of the spring, we were able to reach all but 28 students, and that was due in large part to the efforts of teachers reaching out, and then in the last iteration, in the last sweeps of the plan, it had a lot to do with student services staff, counselors, pupil personnel workers, others, following up and being persistent to track our students down. So a concern we've had throughout this, and I know that because we have so many questions of our community that we need to help us plan, is that every time we put another survey out, I mean, you've seen it, we get a smaller response rate every time. People are tired of surveys, and that's hard because we really need information to plan with. And as we get better, as you know, as we get clearer on what our plan is, we have more questions, but by that point, our response rates are going down. So, you know, our outreach is not yielding as much. So some of it is relying on data we had from before. But with that said, I'm going to ask Mr. Hennigan if he can give some of the more specifics, because we do have efforts going on to make sure we're tracking people down, the people who need the help the most. But let me turn it over to him briefly, and then I can come back if there's more.
Thank you, Dr. Bulson, and thank you, Rachel. So when we did initiate this survey, we initially knew that we needed to reach out to special populations. So we did work directly with the Department of Social Services to ensure that they were aware that these learning centers were in place, and to make any efforts they can to do outreach with the different agencies that they collaborate with to get this information into the hands of parents that they felt may not have otherwise known about it. In addition, we have brought on a position of a homeless liaison, which has been really vital during these summer months, because that person is now doing specific outreach to our homeless populations through the shelters, and not only looking at this piece of it, but also taking a look at making sure that we're going to have connectivity for those students in the fall. So we are doing outreach to those special populations of students who we feel may not, to your point, may not have otherwise seen the media and may not have been aware that this is available. One of the things you mentioned as well is that Mary Beth Stapleton, I know, created a flyer which was handed out at the food sites to get provide some more impetus to people to register for learning centers if they had not done so already. So the good thing is, as was pointed out earlier tonight, this will be sort of an evolving situation where we will try to accommodate more students if we're able to with staffing. We've already created the wait lists so that we can begin to build on that and see if we have more interest moving forward, especially if we have people that were not aware, because I think it's important to note that not everybody who didn't answer because they didn't know about it. Some just didn't need it, therefore decided not to answer. So for those people who weren't aware, that we're able to do continual outreach to them. And I think the student support services staff are the folks that will likely take the charge on that moving forward as our counselors begin to come back to work, and our psychologists and as we employ our PPWs to do some of the work that they did in the spring and summer as well.
Thank you, Buck. So my next question, my guess is probably going to get fielded out to Cornell maybe, or Patty Jo. One of the things that's happening that we're all experiencing, it's going to sound silly, but I'm going to point it out, is a shortage of Lysol and Clorox wipes. So one of the things that I think people forget when talking about opening a building safely is being able to clean the buildings appropriately and having the appropriate products that we can use around our kids and in the building. What kind of issues are we having with getting cleaning products? Because that is a concern for the long term as well, but it is also a concern in the short term for our learning centers. Because, you know, if we're having trouble getting them at, you know, Target or BJ's or wherever, then I'm sure that, you know, our suppliers are as well. So where are we standing in terms of getting our cleaning products and PPE and the things that we know we're going to be looking for? And I already know that Mary Nasuda is going to tell me it's PPE and that I'm not right using that term, but she'll fix me and tell me what it is, because I can't remember. But I was thinking of you, Mary.
So good evening, this is Patty Jo. We ordered the spray bottles and the sanitizer and disinfectant. Wipes have been a problem. So that is back ordered. The other stuff we have coming, and we're waiting for the back order.
Great, thank you. So we're again, just like everybody else, we're trying to get it, but so are multiple other districts and multiple other states, and companies have made it very clear that they are struggling to fulfill orders, and production lines are down. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you, Patty Jo. I know you always do such an amazing job. So my next question is, have we, I guess maybe it's not so much a question. Mr. Thatcher, I swear I'm just asking you a yes or no question. I want to make sure that 504 parents, because sometimes they are not called special ed, but for the purpose of this particular thing, we are including 504 parents and inviting those parents into the town hall for the special ed community, correct?
504 really isn't handled by our special education staff. Accommodations for 504 are delivered by classroom teachers. I'm going to field this. I mean, certainly anybody can listen to the town hall, but I'm going to ask Mr. Hennigan to field that question.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with Mr. Thatcher's statement that the town hall is not going to be exclusive, and I think that in most people's minds, even though we know that the 504 and special education are two separate entities, most people sort of lump them together. So, and we want to respect that. So what we'll do is accommodate that. So if people have specific questions about 504 plans or 504 accommodations and our plans for implementing in and outside of the learning centers, we definitely will welcome that.
Thank you. My next question is, again, possibly logistics. I'm guessing it's going to be a Kathy and Deborah question, actually. How are we planning on delivering food to the kids? Are we talking about bus stops? Are we talking about, how are we going to get food to the kids? So, because they only have that short period of time for lunch. Are we going to do it as at the end of the street? Because there's not going to be enough time for a lot of people to run to a center or something like that.
Hi, this is Deborah Judd. We actually had a conversation today regarding that, and preliminary plans would be to have the food sites at the elementary schools. And similar to what's been done in the spring and the summer, there would be drive-through pickups available for students to receive their meals. We've talked about options with buses, possibly doing some sort of delivery. There's, challenges with that, like with everything, and we'll continue to explore those options. So all of that is still evolving. And, once we've been waiting on numbers to see, who's going to be in learning centers and who may be accessing food from the sites themselves. So our planning is really just getting underway now more robustly than what it has been before now.
And this is Kathy. Just wanted to chime in that transportation is prepared to support food and nutrition in any way that we're able to. We do have some concerns about utilizing bus stops for delivery of food. A safer model would be to look at a location such as a community center or the schools, as it sounds like we'll be starting that at the start of the year. Having students come to the bus stop for food in certain locations would certainly not be a safe option from a transportation perspective, but we will support anything that the food and nutrition department needs so that we can get that out to the community.
Thank you both. So one of my next questions is, I know something that's been talked about is people have been talking about, the SAT being canceled and things like that. Have we heard more from the College Board regarding AP exams and how they're going to work with school districts? Do we have some sort of, way to look at our GT kids and our AP kids so that we're making sure that they too are getting what they need?
Mr. O'Brien, can I kick this one to you?
Sure can. So, and just so everybody's aware, we originally had one SAT date on Saturday, August 29th. So we have canceled that, and we've created actually more opportunities for our students. We have a test date in both September and October for just Harford County Public Schools students at every high school, including Alt-Ed and Harford Tech on both dates. So just for starters, since you mentioned College Board, they're working great with us. And we'll have increased opportunities for students to take the SAT and ACT with us in the fall. In terms of AP, we continue to get, I think Dr. Brown gets weekly notifications from College Board, have worked hard on the curriculum as well as having preparation for the teachers teaching AP. And that is continuing to go as planned. The great thing about AP is they did allow those tests virtually, and students register for those in the fall now. So now that we have SAT, ACT that we feel comfortable with, that we can deliver safely, AP we feel like we'll be able to continue to do and do at a high level.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And again, I'm going to stop with my questions so we can kind of hopefully keep moving through. But thank you again, everyone, because I know that my questions are so minor. You guys have all been able to answer them. And, you know, there is, again, a lot going on that people don't see and can't appreciate because they don't know all that's going on behind the scenes. But I want you to know that we do see you and we do appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question, but before I pose the question, I want to make this announcement. We are going to have as many rounds of questioning and comments as needed. We want the public as well as the board to be comfortable with the decision that they will eventually have to make tonight. So don't worry about the timing. We're going to go around as many times as necessary so that we make an informed decision. At the end of the vote, once the vote is completed on this particular subject matter, we will take another 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene promptly after that. And I'll indicate what time we'll start. But again, don't worry about the timing. We want to make sure we get this right. So, and my question is kind of piggybacks on the one that Rachel just asked about supplies. And so we've identified an issue, well, not an issue, but we had a question about the supplies for cleaning. I want to know about the staff, and this may be a segue into the next item for discussion, but I'd like to know rather, who will be conducting or performing the cleaning of classrooms and buildings in between sessions. What staff will be responsible for making that happen?
Good evening. This is Cornell Brown, Assistant Superintendent for Operations. Our custodial staff will be supporting schools as they normally would for the necessary cleaning of classrooms.
Well, that was a short answer, and hey, you answered the question. So I have no more questions. We're going to start the second round, starting with Dr. Bauer, Dr. Harrell, Ms. Karwacki, Dr. Mueller, Phillips, Riccardi, Rush, Bailey, Godier, and myself. Dr. Bauer.
Thank you. Something may have been mentioned on this earlier, but we had questions about the learning centers checking temperatures for students and potentially staff. Have there been internal discussions for or against having someone with a infrared thermometer checking people when they enter the building?
I think I can take that.
Yes.
This is Mary Nasuda, Supervisor of Health Services. So, yes, we have had that discussion. We've been looking at what they call universal screening and trying to follow the latest public health expertise. And the CDC came out just recently on August the 4th, saying that they do not recommend that universal screening. And there are a couple reasons why. One is the safer plan is to have students and staff who enter the building be well. So if as soon as someone comes into our building who is ill, we have to react with isolation and quarantine, and they've already exposed others. So obviously the better plan is to have someone checked before, and that'll be in the acknowledgement letter to families, and it's also in our employment or employee guidelines as well. It does provide a sort of unfounded sense of security because people think, well, as long as everyone doesn't have a fever, no one has COVID. But about 16% of kids with COVID don't have those symptoms. And it wouldn't really pick up those people who are pre-symptomatic, a couple days before you get sick, you can shed virus. There's also some limitations on those infrared non-touch thermometers, and when we've seen other counties use them, what we find is lots of false positives. So because it's summer right now, kids getting off of these hot buses, they'll come up with a body temperature that seems elevated, and yet when they're able to accommodate to the temperature outside of the buses or outside of the hot weather, we find that they really do have a normal body temperature. So this, of course, delays entry into the building. It gives unnecessary isolation and quarantine. But my biggest worry is that kind of an unintended consequence of checking those temperatures is that we may actually increase exposure because it requires some sort of congregation to get those temperatures taken. Providing 6 feet distancing is hard when you have a big line. I know if you've been waiting in grocery stores, you need to see how long that line can get. You need lots of space. Congregation could occur, and we could actually increase the exposure to sick folks without trying to, just because we're putting another layer in that would delay entry into the building. That being said, it is, today is August the 10th. That might change, and we are continuing to follow that advice. But the very latest recommendation from the CDC just on August 4th was that they were not recommending that universal screening.
Okay, thank you. No more questions for the moment.
Thank you, Dr. Bauer. Dr. Harrell?
I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Ms. Kowacki?
I don't have any questions at this time.
Dr. Mueller?
Okay, I've got one, and it's kind of a big one. So we're talking about staying closed until January, staying closed as far as face-to-face classes. What benchmark will allow the students to go back to school? Is February the absolutely earliest that we would be doing that? And what will in-person classes look like when we return?
Okay, I'll start. I think we've talked a little bit about this, but if others want to jump in and help. So I think this is sort of similar to the question that Ms. Rush asked earlier, is what might cause us to consider this beforehand. And so I kind of described some of the different circumstances that might make it harder for us to move to more in person sooner. But even still, what is the final measure? I think there's a couple of variables that matter. One is an indication from the governor's office that we're moving into stage 3. Now, stage 3 doesn't necessarily guarantee that this is behind us. We still will have, I don't know exactly what those will be, but I think we'll still have some guidance that, there's certain expectations, safety, physical distancing of some kind. There'll be more expectations there. So I think we're waiting to see that a little bit. I also think in this period of time now, again, once we've had a look to see if the limited plan that we have, which is the learning centers, what impact that has. So I think between studying that, between waiting for an indication from the governor about the next stage, looking for new developments with regard to the virus, and constantly thinking about, and we kind of view this as a needle between the risk to students from being out and the risk to students from COVID. We know that I mean, people will point that needle in different directions based on, their personal beliefs about this and their interpretation of the research. But that's always something we're looking at, is the balance between those two things. So as we said before, we do want to get people back. I would hope to be able to do that by the second semester and in some limited circumstances before that. But I don't know that there's one specific measure because, again, those keep changing.
Okay, and the second part of my question was, what will in-person classes look like when they return? I mean, what plans, what are we putting into place now so that when that opportunity to have those classes opens up, we'll be ready?
I think that depends on whether we're able to invite anyone to come back who wants to come back. I think one of the things we are committed to is continuing to provide a virtual option for families to stay out as long as they need to for their own safety. So I think when we come back, there's a chance that we won't have all of our students back. But I don't. Again, one of the concerns with the shift from the hybrid model to the learning center model was there isn't a lot of evidence of these hybrid models being successful. We had a lot of issues. So I'm not sure that we'll be able to design a better hybrid model. It might be that we need to wait and jump into that stage where all students who want to return, and then we think about what safety measures we can still have in place, knowing that we're looking at larger groups. And by that point, I don't know. I think we anticipated that 30 to 50% may choose to stay out if given the choice, even if we were going virtual. But I don't know depending on the poll you read, those numbers could be very different. So I think there's just a lot of variables that will affect that. But in terms of what instruction will look like, what we were planning for was more of a return to traditional instruction, but I don't know which of the current safeguards we would need to carry forward. But again, that's going to depend on a lot of things changing.
I do appreciate that. I understand that. A couple of other questions that I've had, and these might seem a little random, but there are other things that have come up as parents have emailed me and such. One is there's a lot of angst about the technical programs. And especially for some reason, I've had a lot from the large animal program up at North Harford, worried about how their students are going to get that practical experience. And then the other question is about how will enrichment classes for the GT students be handled? So I know those are two very separate questions, but those are the last two I have.
This is Mike O'Brien again. I can certainly hit the first one. We are developing, and maybe it's just a hope that possibly seniors in some of our really essential hands-on programs might be able to return at some point, and maybe it's second quarter. We have planning in place, just thinking about if we're able to do that. So large animal is one that we're looking at. We took the CTE programs and all the programs at Harford Tech and kind of prioritized, hey, if we were able to take seniors from a couple of programs and bring them back in, here's the priorities that they would look like. So I think we want families to know that we do have planning coming in place, just like special ed does, looking at who would we bring in first if we're able to and able to do it safely. We're doing the same thing for CTE programs, targeting seniors especially. But again, we got to kind of wait and see a little bit and see what we can do kind of safely.
And if Dr. Brown could maybe touch on the GT side of the question.
Thank you.
So we, just as everyone has mentioned this evening, we will make sure that we meet the individual needs of all of our students. And so our GT population is no different from that. So we will make sure that the DT teachers at the elementary level will still work with their identified population. And I know our supervisor of personalized learning, Dr. Carpenter, has been working with the GT specialist as well as the media specialist in terms of looking at materials that we currently use in our face-to-face instruction, but how will we accelerate them in the current virtual environment? And in some ways, I think if we think about this as an opportunity for our students, we may be able to accelerate and meet the needs of many more students because we may not have the constraints that we may have once had in a traditional brick and mortar building. So we are looking at all possibilities, and we'll make sure that we meet the needs of everyone throughout the upcoming school year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. And I know just from the interactions I've had with all of you, how hard you've been working to make sure everything is equitable for all of our students. I'm just trying to bring forth some of the questions I've heard from the parents to make sure that those are all addressed tonight. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm done now.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Dr. Phillips.
No questions. I just have one comment, and obviously we're getting close to calling the question and bringing the matter to a vote. I just want to make sure that, let's just say, I mean, we've seen how fast things can change with this disease, and let's say mid-September, Governor Hogan puts us on into phase 3, and I would just hate to be committed to being entirely virtual for the first semester when all of a sudden we have the opportunity to re-explore gradual opening of the buildings to students. So when I just want to make sure that everybody is in agreement and that the question is worded properly, that if the circumstances dictate that we'd be willing to consider, and I used that word earlier, movement to some type of in-classroom learning. Again, assuming all the circumstances are all the appropriate circumstances are met, that we move into to kind of change gears and not just rest on the fact that we've committed to first semester virtual. Therefore, we're not going to be able to change direction in midstream. That's my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Riccardi.
I have a couple more questions. Thank you, President Robinson. How are we going to be addressing the needs of the trade students? For example, Harford Tech.
Mr. Brown, would you talk a little more about that?
I can. So we've worked very closely with Rob Limpert, the supervisor of magnet schools, and not just at Harford Tech, but also the programs at North Harford, the SMA and IB. The first thing we've tried to do is, figure out which are kind of our essential hands-on programs that really require time or a certification piece or a hands-on piece. Recognizing that we're really looking at, half of the year that we're committed to virtually. Kind of like I said to the last question, we are planning on and prioritizing, if we're able, to safely return to any kind of in-person, how we would do that. And so we're in the planning stages of doing that. We're going to be poised that if the circumstances present themselves, no different than Mr. Thatcher kind of talked about with special education, if we're able to do it, we're going to be ready to do it with priority for seniors first and which programs are most essential for hands-on. So we're making no guarantees that we're going to deliver it, but I can tell you that we'll be prepared and able to do it if in case the conditions are correct. And that's precisely why we didn't put a learning support center at Harford Tech. So if conditions do present themselves, then bringing people in, seniors could be part of the plan if conditions end up being okay.
So in the meantime, it's going to be a strict virtual learning from the standard curriculum, and until that's safe to do so, that experience is not going to be able to be given because of the restrictions of the day.
Well, the hands-on wouldn't, but the instructors and teachers of all of our programs are prepared and poised to teach, and the teachers are well aware of what to teach, how to engage the kids, and recognizing that the hands-on part is going to be an essential part. And if we have to put off some of the hands-on part until we return, so be it. We are, prepared to do this virtually, but the sooner we can get back to that hands-on learning for those experiences, the better off we're going to be.
For sure. I have another question. It has to do with a number of emails that we received, and it's a little bit off topic, but I did want to go on the record that I know we've been working diligently to try to respond to all the questions that have come through, not just the opinions, but the questions. And I want to be sure there's a process in place that all questions will get a response. I know there's a lot of frustration with parents that aren't getting answers. And I just wanted some kind of assurance that those with questions and not opinions would get some type of response.
Yes, I would say noted. I mean, I think it's, as you've heard, I mean, a lot of questions kind of embedded in the advocacy. And I think we have a mixture of questions that are just seeking clarity and questions that are framed to advocate. And, as you can see, this has been we've got a very overwhelming response, and in some cases, these are, as Mr. We've indicated earlier, some of these are cut and pasted, some of them are repetitive. So trying to tease out, we're committed to providing answers, to providing responses. In some cases, they're going to be personalized. In some cases, we're trying to answer them in the work so people can see them in settings like this. Every day we're getting a significant number, and none of them are going unnoted, but at the same time, there is that triage effect of literally the number of people available to work on this and the time differential between crafting responses and seeking larger answers that support the good of the entire organization. And that's where a lot of people are targeting their time right now. So yes, it is our goal to provide responses wherever possible, but in some cases they'll be more generic, in other cases we'll be able to get more targeted ones. But I certainly understand the concern, and like you, I'm committed to the customer service, but there's been a lot to confront.
Thank you.
You done?
Yes, I'll turn it over to Tamara. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Rush.
Nothing, sir. Thank you.
Ms. Bailey. Ms. Bailey. Ms. Gaudier.
I have nothing left. I think we've kind of gotten many of our questions answered this evening, and hopefully a number of the ones that I read tonight.
I'll try Ms. Bailey again. I have no questions or comments. Dr. Bulson, would you, well, let me back up. Does any other board member have any questions, comments they'd like to make at this time? Please do so. Hearing none. Dr. Bulson, would you please frame the question for the vote tonight?
Yes, and of course, this is an unusual call to a vote because it's a really unusual circumstance that much of this is operational, but I think because it's such an important discussion for this community, for the school system, that it's critical that the board be a part of this. So we did raise this as an action item rather than just an information item. That being said, I think the major question at hand here is, while there are still details, I mean, this plan is going to be living and breathing and changing every day, probably through the rest of this calendar year. But the general outline, as you've heard it this evening, the intention, the trajectory, and I think one thing that has been revisited multiple times is the spirit and the commitment on behalf of the board and the school system to remain flexible, as long as we can also keep people aware of the fact that there, are legitimate barriers to changing things quickly. But we'll be committed to, as circumstances change, as new information comes from the state and others, we're willing to make changes to this. But I guess the question I'd ask for the board's vote on is, at this point, we have indicated the proposal to have instruction be fully virtual, with the addition of the operation and the expectation that we will operate the learning centers as we've described them. And so I think those are the core elements of the plan that we ask, that the administration asks for your support on. So in this particular question, if you're willing to support those two core elements, I believe that would be the core of this vote.
Thank you. Board members, you've heard the question. May I have a motion to approve?
This is David. I move to approve the superintendent's recommendation for the continuity of learning plan.
This is Rachel. I second that motion.
Is there any discussion? Hearing none. Ms. Smith, would you please call the roll?
Dr. Bauer,
Yes.
Dr. Harold,
Yes.
Ms. Karwacki,
Yes.
Dr. Mueller,
Yes.
Dr. Phillips,
Yes.
Ms. Riccardi,
Yes.
Ms. Rush,
No.
Ms. Gaudier,
Yes.
President Robinson,
Yes.
Miss Bailey, Miss Bailey. This motion passes with 8 affirmative to 1 negative roll call vote.
Thank you.